Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose hosts hundreds of in person events, along with our partnered and supported events, trips, and classes, so please check our website for a full list. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask all of you to please turn off or silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at the microphone over here before asking your questions. It is my honor to introduce all of you to Mark Doten. Mark is the author of Trump Sky Alpha and The Infernal, one of Granta's 2017 Best of Young American Novelists. They are an editor at Soho Press and have taught at Princeton University and Columbia University. Tonight, they will be talking about their new short story collection, Whites. In this profound and illuminating work of satire, Mark examines the white person's psyche through stories that lay bare their self belief and character at the forefront. Publishers Weekly writes that Doten delivers an uncompromising satire of contemporary white supremacy in this bold collection. Every character is painfully convincing in their anger, condescension, or meekness. It is a wild and caustic ride. Mark will be in conversation with Shannon Sanders. Shannon is the author of the forthcoming novel, The Great Wherever, which comes out next July, and of the Link Short Story Collection Company, which won the 2024 LA Times Book Prize's Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. Her short fiction has appeared in One Story, Sewanee Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. Everyone, let us all welcome Mark Doten and Shannon Sanders.
Can you hear me? Okay. I had such a pleasure reading this book, and so I'm excited that Mark is going to read an excerpt for us, if you're ready.
I'm ready. Okay, this is the first story in the. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Politics and Prose, for hosting this. I've done an event here at Politics and Prose for all three of my books, and it's one of the great bookstores in the world, and I'm so happy I can be here. And thank you, Bernard, for that introduction. Okay, this is called Even Elon on Human Meat. It's the first story in the book. I'm going to read about 5 or 6 minutes of it. The setup to it, I'll tell you, is just that the whole story takes place in the seconds after a rocket launched by the company of the titular Elon blows up, and a bunch of workers at his company get lit on fire, and he has many thoughts as everyone's running around screaming with, their hair on fire. Even Elon on Human Meat. And there's a quote from Elon Musk's X account. Unless it is stopped, the woke mind virus will destroy civilization and humanity will never reach Mars. I was there that day, swept along on waves of heat and data when I felt under my left foot, then the right, the unmistakable, yuck, feeling that I was walking on a human body. I had never walked on a human body before, but I knew that's what it was. Even in my Nike Alpha Flies with their next-gen cushioning tech, even as the launch team came shrieking past me like idiots, hair on fire and hands flailing overhead, it was a yep, that's a human body. The foot is our interface with the ground, our main point of contact with the planet we live on, and it gives us both postural control and much of our proprioceptive capacity, our feel for our own bodies as they extend into and move through space. 26 bones and 33 joints and more sensory nerves per square inch than anywhere else in the human body, along with 100 plus tendons and muscles, and that's for each foot, so double it. I wondered if anyone else was walking on a human body, but no, it was only me, I'm sure of it. I was the only one walking on a human body, and that quality of being on a body seemed to slow time or thicken it. And we were the eye of everything, me and the human body, the serene point around which whirled 1,000 torched idiots. The human foot and its capacities had already been front of mind for me. A thought in one sector, you see, leads to an innovation in another, which leads to another thought, which leads to an innovation in yet another sector, and so on. Which is another way of saying that everything is connected. And when I am in a flow state, I find those connections profoundly legible. And so, even as our rocket was successfully test launched, and yes, it was a great success, a rocket that blows up is often the most successful rocket because the fact of the explosion is so rich with information about the rocket and the launch procedures, and also revealing the idiots and bunglers who need to be axed. But I was also thinking about the next major event, the humanoid robots we'd be demoing on Tuesday. Robots that would require the same sort of robust, intuitive mapping that I myself was bringing to bear as I slowly walked across the body of the human female. My robots would need to feel what I was feeling, map what I was mapping, and what I was mapping was not merely the contact points between foot and body. It's as though my feet were suddenly bats or tiny dolphins casting sonar into the figure and telling me everything about the body and the person within the body. Sweatshirt and the rib cage, the flesh of an almost certainly female chest, the bony knot of a hand clenching a phone, which made me laugh a little. As if your grip on your phone can save you from being trampled. As if a trampled body has need of a phone. And beyond all of that, a squish and resistance so precisely anatomical that it's too yucky to describe. Ugh, blech.
Thank you. That story is really something. It is very funny, well encapsulated there in that reading. And I have a bunch of questions that I am hoping we'll get a chance to get to most of. I sort of intended to go from the general to the specific, but I actually want to start with an off-book one that comes from that story, because a couple of times in this book, so there, and then again a bit later with another figure that we who are chronically online and following the news have the misfortune of knowing very well, you do sort of a mimicry of the actual communication style of these well-known figures. So there's Elon Musk, later we get Donald Trump. Can you talk about the process of finding the voices of those characters and what it was like to write that closely to those characters?
Sure. And Shannon, thank you so much for doing this. It varies. I think the closeness of the prose in the book to the voice of the person varies considerably. In the one you just heard, it's not that close. It has a similarly arrogant, asshole-ish quality, but the sort of spiraling long sentences. It's not exactly how Elon talks, but in that story, I wanted to. Can people hear me? Okay. In that story, I was more interested in finding a prose form that would allow for a voice that kind of keeps tumbling forward and can throw out a bunch of ideas and then circle around them and have a kind of a rhythm and propulsiveness. Because ultimately the second 2/3 of the story, which you didn't hear, he's still walking on this body and he is afflicted by this moment of the woke mind virus, even though he hates the woke mind virus, where he still thinks about it in those terms and he wonders what if the person he's walking on is black, and that inspires that drives the rest of the story, is thinking about how he doesn't want to be thinking about that.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And okay, so I'm going to go back to the general. Can you tell us, for those who haven't read the book yet, give us a sense of what the book is?
Yeah, this is a book with a bunch of different white people as primarily as narrators, or in the third and second person stories, protagonists, but mainly they're white people telling their stories, trying to, I would say they share a desperate kind of desire to be correct, and that drives their narration. The kind of, why are they telling this story? What are they? What is their position on things? It's that, to control narrative.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And the stories are not, they're not linked stories, but they are very thematically linked. They are linked in many cases by subject matter, by current events. And then something else that links them is that I think all or nearly all of them are written in a very close, almost invasive first person. And so we get, in the example that you just read from, we get sort of that freewheeling thought process, that sort of that process of putting connections together and sort of the tumble forward of someone going through their own psyche. Can you talk about choosing to write in first person for most of them?
Yeah, I love first person narrators because with the third person narrator, you have a certain amount of distance, and even a very close third. There's always the question of are we directly channeling the character's thoughts? I mean, there's a gap, which is also very interesting for some writers to play with. But I like the first person because I love the way it allows for certain kinds of unreliability, certain slippages of of history. Yeah, I think a lot of the writers I most admire and am most influenced by use a somewhat unreliable first person. Kazuo Ishiguro does that over and over again in his novels as people narrate the past, and then things come along to shift our understanding of what that past was, and sometimes to shift the character's understanding of what it is. And it's also, in addition to allowing a lot of malleability with what happened, uh, the first person is also a great mode for people who are, for narrators who are not, who are not sane. Uh,
Yeah, it does. It lets you play a lot with reliability. It also, I think, can convey some degree of self obsession, and gives you a chance to control how much of any other perspective the character is willing to relate to or willing to even acknowledge.
right.
Yeah, so I think that it's a really interesting choice here, and it is extremely, the effect is really potent. Um, we talked a little bit in the green room, and you told me that this book has been a long time coming, that you worked on it for a while, but it feels very of the moment. There's so much that's going on that's topical, that has happened even within the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years.
Hmm.
So what sorts of research did you do? And related question, did you have these various story ideas and then discover that they were linked by the idea of how whiteness plays into them, or vice versa?
Yeah, that unifying idea of whiteness came up. I don't know. I'd written a few of the stories already, and I noticed that this was emerging. I think the oldest stories included like a mass shooter during maybe the first Trump administration. Then Trump himself has a story here he narrates here. There were January 6th insurrectionists. And I was, thinking about, well, how, we're living in this incredibly fraught time where questions of, racial justice and racism and, a very vocally resurgent white supremacist movement has been gaining huge amounts of power. So it seemed like I was trying to figure out how this book can address that and plug into it. And one possibility would have been to very to not write white character, like to write characters of various races and try to get at things from different sides. But I think, that could be a really good book, but with my own particular set of skills, I think actually just showing a lot of white people being horrible, but in different ways and from different parts of the political spectrum. There's almost as many left liberal people in this book as there are conservatives or Trumpists.
Yeah, that really stands out. The fact that the spectrum is reflected, but so many of the frailties, I think, are kind of echoed across the spectrum. And there are a few themes that sort of make recurring appearances throughout the book. So the pandemic is extremely, it's almost its own character in the book, really, in the way that it surfaces in so many cases. January 6th and so on. And so it seems to be saying something about whiteness and its relationship to those generation defining events. What can you say about that?
I think the years of the Black Lives Matter movement, there are up to the present, the years of the pandemic as well have been ones in which I want to say white people get challenged in a lot of ways, and it really can create a lot of defensiveness. And defensiveness and deflection and avoidance are all interesting things to me from a narrative perspective. Um, all these people feel like they're one of the good ones, I mean, the ones who on the left, the ones on the right, they also feel like they're good, but for different reasons.
I think it probably is. Maybe it's less of a priority. There's something else that I notice about a lot of the characters. There's this recurring idea of wanting very badly to be right, wanting for the narrative to smile on them. And it's really interesting to see the way that drives their actions in a lot of the stories.
Yeah, I mean, because the last 10 or 15 years have been so interesting in terms of the rise of social media, and then the way in which social media has fed into politics, and the ways in which wokeness, anti-wokeness, have become these hugely performative facts of social media. And I'm obviously not the first person to say that. There's whole threads of kind of vast debates on the internet about well, what you're doing is just performative, and it assumes like meta level after meta level as people well, no, you're the one who's performative. And I think for people who are online a lot of time, who are very online types, you get a lot of, people are very stuck in their head about these issues, and that's something I was interested in tapping into.
Yeah, I wanted to go here actually. It is a very online book. We spend time in message boards. We have people obsessing over how they have been represented in YouTube videos and social media. Did you have to do any research to get that right? Did you have enough just coming in native experience in those worlds? And what was that like?
Yeah, I don't think I had to do much research that I wasn't already doing. I've kind of ditched X because it was just too stressful. But I loved or was sort of really attracted to some of these strange Twitter arguments that get going. Like there's something really fascinating about the types of pylons that can occur. Like the one that sticks with me, which is not something the book talks about, but there was someone whose child wandered off to a body of water in Florida and got eaten by an alligator. And do you remember that?
I do.
And do you remember the internet?
Yes, yeah.
So a Twitter account is like, I am so over white men and their privilege that I don't even care about this kid getting eaten by an alligator. Oh, I don't care about a sign. A sign says I can't be on this beach. F a sign. And yeah, so this person said that, and that sparked a backlash. And then there was a lot of commentary about, wait, her Twitter, there was a sort of a hint of, I mean, black speech in the way she tweeted. And I think a lot of people initially thought the tweeter was black and her avatar was really in shadow. It was like a silhouette. And then it turned out she was white, and everyone piled on her about that too. And it became this just kind of amazing thing. And the center of it is this,
Kid.
stupid, terrible
Yeah.
tragedy.
Yeah.
And yeah, but that's the internet. Am I getting that story right?
That's actually more of it than I remembered, but I think that all of that sounds right. Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. And I think that's a cycle we've seen in another few pile-ons since then.
Mhm.
The backlash being discovering something about the identity of the original piler on,
Right.
ending up making it snowball way beyond. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of, and then I'm going to go into a few of the stories themselves. In terms of the craft of the stories, there are at least two, maybe more than that. But so the Banana Bunch, is it called Banana Bunch Challenge, and then also Dying, but it's something else. Those stories come in multiple parts. One is a diptych and one is a triptych. Can you talk about your choice to take that approach of head hopping? So we have sort of one segment that's from one perspective, and it is a white person behaving badly, followed by another one behaving badly in a different way or having a different set of hangups, and then in
Right.
the other case, a third one even.
Yeah. I mean, in general, those decisions are to, when you're within one person's head, of course, you're limited in what you can tell. So generally, the second and third voices provide like new angles on the narrative, and there's a kind of a puzzle element to it. But I think it allows you to be more expansive and retell events from different points of view. And in terms of the Banana Bunch Challenge, that story was it's narrated by a gay incel would-be mass shooter white supremacist, and that is a interesting point of view to write from, but it's also limited. And it's all going up on, like, he's basically writing the story in the form of a manifesto that he's posting on his website right before he goes, like, after he kills his dad and stepmom, and then goes off to commit his violent act. And we don't see this in his part, but like, he trips on the way in and accidentally blows his own head off, and that puts a kind of hard stop on the story he was telling. But I didn't want to get in like the kind of comic slip on a banana peel, hit in the face with a rake element of this character who, it's sort of built up and prepared for, and make it somewhat comic, because there's kind of a lot of tricky issues around depicting mass shootings in media. Like, you don't want it to be seductive. You don't want it to. Not that I don't think I have a big enough audience that I'm going to be having, like, 13-year-olds who want to be mass shooters, like, read my book and be like, yes. But just to I mean, that's certainly one thing I got in my own head about, was like the ethics of writing about mass shooting. And then it switches to two boys at the school who had been hit by like a ricochet, shrapnel from that guy's shot. And then they have a whole arc of their own about, basically, why aren't we getting as much attention as these other kids who were in mass shootings? And it just allows a different angle on things, and allows a different type of kind of social media points wanting to come from a very different set of pair of characters.
Yeah, it's such an interesting choice. As a writer, I really enjoy that, because it is so much fun to be able to come to the end of what you wanted to say about a character and just move on. Um, And so I am not a satire writer, but obviously this book is extremely steeped in satire, and there's such smart stories, and there's something that is so challenging, which is that you have to make satire effective, you have to be very close to your subject matter, you have to render it very accurately, and then you have to kind of walk up to a line where there is a choice about whether to offer redemption,
Mm-hmm.
by humanizing the subject so much that then we, the reader, begin to understand them differently, or to not do that, to sort of pull back and not offer that redemption. Uh, and I think maybe my favorite story in the book is the title story, Whites, which it sort of plays with that line very much. So, without giving too much away, I guess, about the story itself, can you talk about that decision-making process with respect to writing satire?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question with with narrative and stuff is especially someone who's like reached. So the title character is a woman who worked for or created a nonprofit housing organization which helps get unhoused people housed. And she also, at a big event, just as the pandemic was winding down, their first in public event, had an encounter with a black teenager that ended up getting her called like the worst Karen in the world. And, she is telling this story from she's obviously she loses her job, she loses her apartment, she has to move in with a sibling and just lives in the basement there and obviously just ruminates on everything that's happened and thinks about all these excuses and wants like it's a story that she's telling and it keeps going off in different directions because she has so many ways in which she feels she was wronged and people's uh, pieces of the narrative she wants to put together so we can see it the way she sees it, which is she's a victim. And even though she knows it's kind of futile, but she can't help herself. Like that's part of it. Like she knows that when she publishes this article, like it's not going to really help, but she hopes it will. And with that one, yeah, she has this redemptive moment at the end, but it's it's a very I would say it's toxic redemption. Like it's a very narcissistic type of redemption, and it's one of a couple stories that talk about mindfulness and meditation. She's someone who gets very into that, and she's someone who, you know, using her meditation app provides genuine relief from the stress and anxiety she's constantly awash in. But it also, in her case, she kind of weaponizes meditation to as self justification, and I don't think she would ever become a world class meditator unless she lets go of some of those narratives.
In that story, there is a non-binary black character who the main character has to interact with a lot. And in fact, in a lot of the stories, whiteness has to be thrown into relief by other, right? And so there are a lot of stories in the book in which there are prominent characters of color who either expose things about the characters or who in some way antagonize them. Can you talk a little bit about developing those characters? I'm thinking about there's a pair of podcasting black sisters who
Yeah.
really challenge a cookie CEO. There's that character that I just mentioned. There is the woman that Elon Musk is walking on, theoretically.
Right.
Yeah,
Who may or may not be black.
we don't know.
We have no idea.
It is a woman though, so there's
Yes,
that.
he feels confident about that. That the body he is walking on for the entire course of that story is female. I think, in terms of when I made that decision, okay, all the central characters are going to be white, then of course, that becomes the question of what, like, obviously an entirely white book is not going to allow you to think much about whiteness.
We won't see the whiteness, yeah.
Yeah. So as you say, these characters throw things into contrast, and they also provide kind of in the title story, Whites, with the non-binary Black employee of the narrator, like she's really, really set on making sure we understand that they are a bad employee and that this is kind of everything that happened is kind of their fault. So that's interesting to play with, and I think you also see, you see things about that character hopefully beyond what the narrator is saying, and understand that, we're not really to take the words of these characters at face value. And for the story about the two Black podcasters, it's sort of my version of like a horror movie where like podcasters are often at the beginning of horror movies these days. It's a real trope. And these two women have a podcast that explores crimes, little known crimes against Black people or forgotten crimes against Black people. They go to this cookie factory in northern Minnesota and to investigate these murders that happened there. And the story is then delivered from the point of view of a white person talking to them or talking to one of them. And, the kind of monstrousness of who he is and what he's doing emerges very gradually.
And it's worth saying again, because these are mostly in first person, and a lot of the time they take the form of diatribes, missives. And so those characters, the Black characters, the other characters of color, are not necessarily given a voice on the page. And so we have to come to see them in what is being interpreted or misinterpreted by these narrators in a lot of cases. So I think that that's really interesting, and it's done very cleverly. Have you ever written horror?
No, but I have
Because
my
there's a horror
previous
story in
two.
the book. So yeah.
But
Go
yeah,
ahead.
my previous two books have, I would say, body horror influence. There's lots of gross things that happen to human bodies and kind of things that wouldn't plausibly happen in our consensus reality.
Yeah. Because, and I won't say which story it is, I guess, but there is a horror story in the book, and I found it quite creepy. It stayed with me for a while after. Can you talk a little bit about building suspense?
Yeah, I think, and are we getting a?
We got
Okay.
the symbol, but
Okay.
I thought we could maybe do this last one, and then I have one quick one after that, and then we'll go to Q&A. Okay.
You bet. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, suspense is is something that's really fun to play with in first-person narrators. The great Nabokov novel Pale Fire is one that we learn like bit by bit things from the perspective of Charles Kinboat, the commentator, and it allows for a really interesting kind of unreliability. I think of the Agatha Christie novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is I won't is it does really interesting things with narrative that had never been done before, or maybe had been done before but not so successfully. And it's certainly one of her greatest novels and one of the great 20th century novels. But I think about like how do you let information out? Like first. It's fraught in one way with third-person narrators because you realize how totally arbitrary and constructed it is. Like they can tell you anything they want at any time they want to, and when they're withholding things, it's something we accept. But it feels intentional and can feel authorial in a way that the first person, again, you see the narrative wheels turning, but it's really, you can play with things in a really fun way. And especially when you've got like a big dark secret, you can slowly set it up and, like kind of setting up the pieces of a bomb so it'll explode right at the end of the story.
Yeah. And this is my final question. This can be whatever comes to mind first. What was the most challenging thing to tackle in writing this book?
It was definitely in there were two things. One was the title story, Whites, and the other was the very long story Jumpman. But I'll go with Whites. That was one that this book was supposed to come out like over a year ago, and I was so late on doing the revisions for Whites and Jumpman that basically these two stories took a year for me to finish. And with Whites, it was this. So the narrator's this very reactive, self-justifying white woman, and she had so many thought, like the character was producing so many thoughts and so many angles into which you can be like, oh, but this happened and this happened and this happened, that it was really hard to pull into a narrative, because it's ultimately kind of a collection of dozens of excuses for what happened. And to me, that was incredibly difficult, was figuring out, okay, when is this done? What do I need to do to pull it together? And there's huge amounts, like that story could have been a short novel easily. I'm glad it didn't become one, but I know so many things about versions of that character that are not in the story.
Yeah, maybe one day. Never say never. Well, it comes together really well in the finished product, and I would love to open it up now to audience questions.
So first of all, you can hear me, right? First of all, I just wanted to mention, apropos of the unreliable narrator thing, I wrote a story that was a justification of a murder by a unreliable narrator who's a great admirer of Edgar Allan Poe and actually thinks that the unreliable narrators in Poe are completely unironic and we're on the right side of things. So somebody decided to write an essay about this in a book on autofiction. And I had the delightful experience of looking in the index and seeing Welt, Bernard - homicidal maniac. That was really fun.
Nice.
So, also, a couple of times I've been asked to contribute to something that had to do with politics and, making a statement, et cetera, and responding to our time. And on one occasion, for example, I wrote a story about Nero that I thought was very funny and, it was satirical. And the first response I got was, well, that's really not about the politics of our time. And I sort of, just let that go. But for me, a lot of the most interesting and important and effective political writing is satirical. So I wonder, if it has something to do with the fact that many of us feel we have to get away from the horrors of the present moment. And I don't just mean our present moment. I mean, Shakespeare addressed the Elizabethan and Jacobean worlds through writing about ancient Rome and ancient Britain and stuff. If you feel like, because this is all over your career, if you feel like defending the virtues of satire and why you fall into it so much, not fall into it, but choose it.
Yeah.
Because you're a funny guy, but
for me, there's big questions. Well, why write satirically about our present moment when Trump is a satire of Trump already? Like, he's always going to be stranger and more. He's going to be more singular. Like, no one can do Trump better than Trump. And also, like, comedy news shows like The Daily Show and so on or The Onion can give us really, funny, sharp takes on contemporary things. So I don't think that's what fiction is best at. Like, what fiction does is, you can use the tools of fiction to do something else, which is, for me, I'm interested in taking these real life characters and just pushing on them and deforming them greatly. Like, there's very few of my stories that sit close to the really close to the reality. And I think what fiction can do, like in the Elon Musk story, is, for instance, one thing it can do is it can offer us kinds of time freezes that you can't do in other form, like The Daily Show can't do, and movies can do, but like in the Flash way that isn't very good for thinking about politics. But fiction can can do anything you want to with the laws of physics. So you can have a story that would take 20 minutes to read out loud, or half an hour to read out loud, and have that all happen in a few seconds. And I think, I think the specifically fictional tools that we have, involve things that are really good at the world right now, at the unreliability, the multiple feeds of information. Fiction is really good at capturing information flow, if you wanted to do that, and it's always been good at that. You think of Moby Dick. There's a lot of information in there, and it captures something about the way information was distributed in its time, and it can be biblical at times, like sermon, and it can be informational, and it can just be documenting the science of the time. So, fiction is able to channel lots of different types of discourse, and I think that's in terms of, but why it's just like I just consume politics, or until recently I just consumed politics constantly. So it's just the material that I'm most interested in. Does that answer
Yeah, and
that?
you also know a lot. Yeah, I just want to make sure. I didn't mean parody. I really mean satire in the sense that 1984 is satire.
Well, I'm sorry, it's too late. This has been recorded, and
All right.
and forever you're gonna be the guy who said parody when he meant satire. I'm sorry, Bernard.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, we got 2 questions coming up. No, go ahead, sir.
So I have obviously not read the book, but look forward to doing it. But the way you described it, I mean, most of the stories or characters seem to be extreme. I mean, you use the word monstrous. Some things, if not extreme in the one sense, pathological, maybe. But is that more because you needed the story or the stories to be a little punchy or something to anchor deeply? Or because there is another type of, and I'm just wondering in that sense that are there stories which are, so some of the most satirical stuff, and maybe because I'm coming from another culture and I've actually lived in 4 different, is it's just, the way groups of people in different, let's say whites or Chinese or Indian, we often talk about how we react to fairly normal, routine situations very differently. And I'm just wondering, did you have stories of that type? Did you consider it? And lastly, I guess it's in the same vein, the cultural differences as opposed to, let's say, the racial or the difference between the class, some of the dimensions of whites that you talk about in this country tend to be more of a class issue, how certain classes behave different vis-a-vis other classes. So I'm not sure I'm being clear, but
No, those are 2 excellent questions. I think if I can rearticulate, your second question is about the ways in which, do I have stories where the sort of way things are cut up is less about race specifically, and maybe more about a class or the relationship between.
more about focusing, even though your narrative maybe makes you look at the individual, but the basic story is about groups of people interacting.
Yeah.
Same story, same topic could be, let's say, we have, as an Indian, we often have lots of stories about Indians behaving very differently, and you go to the same situation as, whether you call it Americans or whites, and the dominant class in a particular group. Individual versus group.
Yeah, I think one thing that whites, for instance, do share, like actual ones, not the ones in my book, is a kind of a reactivity or defensiveness when it comes to racial issues. I'm not saying that's universal, but it's certainly common on, for the right and the left. I think I think that maybe is the unifying thing, is that kind of defensiveness and reactivity, which you see on both the right and the left. With this book, I wanted to have narrators from very different class positions, from different political positions, and they're all, should be weird in their own way. Does that answer the question at all?
Second one.
Okay.
First one is
Can,
non-weird situations.
what's that? Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I have so much admiration for writers who can write about, really quotidian stuff and make that work. I mean, that is such a incredible gift, and that is definitely not what I do. Like, everything is pushed to be, grotesque, extreme. Even a story like the title story here, which starts out with a fairly grounded narrator, it has some kind of really weird and gross body stuff happen, and there's I definitely, like, I have lots of stories that end like the moment before someone is murdered or dies in some way. I mean, maybe not lots, but it definitely happens. So no, although I think that kind of fiction is great. And I'm trying to think of a really good example of it right now. I think, like, Peter Taylor. Is any Peter Taylor fans here? No? Summons to Memphis. It's really good. But it does have a person dies in it. Spoiler. But yeah, if you want something like that that's amazing writing without people turning into monsters or summoning demons from hell, as in, like, my book, I recommend Summons to Memphis by Peter Taylor. Question?
Hi.
Hello.
So two questions. One is very quick, and then the other one is a little long. So you talked about the defensiveness of, like, white people usually in writing, and we see it in today's world a lot too, with everything happening, like the wokeness and dialing back, like social justice, like the museums, and dialing back that because they think it's going to make white people feel bad. Did you, when writing this, because I'm a writer as well, like, when writing this, did you look at any of your own viewpoints being, I'm assuming you're white, like, did you look back and, like, reflect on your own whiteness when writing this and writing these stories, and seeing how, like, did you maybe have any bias or any of that when writing it, or, like, how could you also show, like, the human parts of some of these characters while also showing that, like you said, you had the toxic redemption of one character, of, like, showing, it sometimes it comes from a place of misunderstanding, but sometimes it's like, no, they, like you said, they actually know what they're doing. They're not stupid. Like, they know everything that's happening, like left and right, like. And then the second question is, how did you come up with the art cover of, like,
Oh, yeah.
like that with the title Whites,
Thank you for those questions. And yeah, so first one, yeah, I mean, it's really easy for me to go into, like, a sort of thought spiral and be defensive and so on. Like, there's one character in the story Jumpman that I mentioned as one of the other very long stories, who gets really mad. He's a big Nightmare Before Christmas fan, and he's really mad when he goes to college and a black woman in his class says that the character of Oogie Boogie is racist. I don't know if anyone has seen that movie, but yeah, and Oogie Boogie is definitely racist. I mean, there's just no question. Like, he's a caricature, but it's really, I mean, people are so defensive about the things that they invest in from their childhood. And, I didn't, the character is a little younger than I am, and I did not have a deep connection to Nightmare Before Christmas, but I can remember, like, having, like, just in high school, like, reading a review of the movie Bulworth, and which is Warren Beatty's kind of interesting 90s movie about race and politics. And the review was saying that he he shouldn't have done this. He's not, something like he's not the one to tell this story. And I remember feeling really like, oh, that's not fair. And that always stuck with me, that I had that reaction of like wanting to defend this movie that I hadn't seen when I was like 15. Like, where did that come from? And I think that that's, that's something that I have a lot of access to. So it's not the, yeah, I mean, it plays out in different ways. If I'm writing, like a satanic mass murderer, but even the satanic mass murderers, like they kind of have the same reaction to discourse, which is getting defensive and getting mad and like trying to explain. And okay, and the other question was, does that answer that one?
And the other question was the book cover.
Oh, the book cover, yeah. An amazing cover designer named Capo Wang did that. He also did my first book cover, my novel The Infernal, and he does lots of Grey Wolf titles. And yeah, I had suggested the idea of maybe using a photograph of a white animal, such as a polar bear, a goat, a snow monkey, and they went in that direction. This was just clearly, this goat is amazing. That's a goat.
It is. It's a great cover.
I'm going to follow the trend of two-part questions. So I think the New York Times review of your book, which was very glowing, concluded with something like, I can't remember exactly, but something like, I'm so glad that writers like Mark Doten exist, and they're doing the hard work of telling these stories. And it's hard to write, I'm sure, and it's hard to read. And I think it's the cover of the book, but again, can't remember where I wrote it, but it was like, if enough people read this, maybe it'll change the world. Or I can't remember exactly where that sentiment was, but it was something else I read somewhere. And so the two-part question is, one, how do you cope living with these awful people in your head and having to inhabit them? And then two, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to affect the rest of the world? Are you trying to affect a few people, or are you just processing the awfulness of what you see out there?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. For part two, I am not trying to affect political change. I think it's pretty rare that fiction can do that. I think, there are certainly, I mean, you think of writers like, for instance, Toni Morrison's fiction radically transformed the way that African Americans, the way that blacks are depicted in the culture, and had a huge effect on literature, on history as an academic field, and that is, fiction can do that sometimes, but I don't think my kind of fiction can do that. I genuinely think that the fiction that has the ability to do political change is usually written from from a minority perspective, whether that is racially or sexual minority, and is able to introduce like sort of new ways of seeing a culture, or a culture representing itself, and that can be political. And like, I mean, Toni Morrison is no longer with us and hasn't been for a while, but that type of work is still very much doable. But I think, for my type of book, like, it's much more just kind of capturing the air of the moment, rather than thinking that I'm going to change anyone.
Terrible people in your head?
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's terrible people are funny. Like, the worst people in the world are also like the funniest. And, I think a lot of my writing goes back to, sort of basic comedic stances, like the idiot who thinks they're the smartest person in the room and that they know it all is an incredibly rich type of character to work with, and even if they're like, their politics are awful, that makes it more fun. And like, we live in a time of vast inconsistency with in terms of the discourse and the contradictions. It's funny, like I think I heard my brother use the word hypocrisy yesterday, and it's like that word barely functions anymore, like because there's no base against which to, there's no like consensus truth against which we're measuring someone's hypocrisy. It's all just these sort of floating, streams of self-justification and insanity and like desire for power and desire for recognition. And that's interesting. I mean, it's horribly frustrating, like to see it in play. Like the president, I heard him at the Zelensky news conference. He was going on and on about, Washington, D.C., it's finally, people can finally go out and eat dinner outside for the first time in years. This place was a war zone. He's sitting at Zelensky. He's like, it was the most dangerous place in the world, with like no self-awareness about it. And Zelensky's kind of like, And, my friend who's a golfer, his son came here and he said his son ate outside. And I said, would you let him eat outside before? And he's like, no way, Mr. President, way too dangerous. And it's just so insanely far from the reality. By the way, thank you all for trekking in through the most dangerous territory in the world to get here tonight. But it's absolutely insane making too, because there's, all these, like the military out on the streets, and it's just infuriating to deal with in the actual reality of it, but fun to deal with in fiction, I guess.
And by the way, every character in this book is a recognizable, believable proxy for people we all know and interact with, I think, on a regular basis. So it's got to be at least a little bit easier to be able to move the terrible people around versus just enduring them. I would think. Can I ask a quick Can I ask a quick question? Unless anyone else has one.
Be very careful not to pop your peas now that you've lost your screen.
Exactly. Okay, I can't be too plosive. Has this book pissed anyone off that you're aware of?
No, I don't think so. There's a I'm not on Facebook, an Instagram account that was like a pile of barf, and it was named, like, the account was like, I don't know, Barf Lord 3000 or something, who said racist trash, and underneath one of my posts about the book. And I am just curious, and this person has like 2 followers and follows 100 people. Like, it's obviously like a troll account, right? But I was really curious if he was thinking that from like the right or the left, and that's kind of the mystery, because a Trump supporter might say, "Oh, like, this is racist because it's saying white people are terrible," and someone else can be like, "Well, I don't want to read about white people. Let's stop centering whiteness," and so that I guess that's my question. But trolling does not need to have a consistent political belief. But no, I haven't pissed anyone off. Those people don't read. Remember, like the Iraq War in the early 2000s, when there were like so-called intellectuals in the Republican Party, and they all had these big intellectual ideas, like the new republic was churning out justifications for war, and the neocons all took pride in their like university educations and their degrees and their intellectual and political heft. I mean, that sucked, but this sucks too.
Well said. Any other audience questions?
I have a comment, Mark.
Yes.
Did you know that you're like 3 doors away from the Pizzagate?
Oh, yeah.
I just didn't know.
Where there definitely are not people being hoarded in the basement for Hillary Clinton to drink their blood. Wink.
I got married there.
Ah, how nice. Yeah. Okay. Last question. I think we got like.
Last question. Okay. So I just want you to have some fun, and not that you're not already. That so much has happened. You said the book finished a year ago. You had to clean some stuff up. If you were, based on what you've seen in the last several months of just insanity, to create quickly a new character in your head, what character would that be?
God, I would absolutely love to see some fiction that really engages with what was happening inside the Department of Government Accountability or whatever. Like, that was so, it's so weird and it's so unprecedented. And how did that just happen? You know, it's like USAID doesn't exist anymore. Like, what the, but the inside of it, you know, it's just a bunch of like dorky edgelords who know how to code or something like that, like who Elon likes. It's so weird. So that would be something I'd, you know, and my Elon story was written well before he became our like de facto president for a month and cut half of the government. That's so weird. How did that happen? I want to read about that. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah.
Thank you for doing this, Shannon. Thank you, everyone,
was so
for coming
fun.
out.
Thank you, Mark and Shannon.